Welcome. I'm Tracy Smith, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. Nina Totenberg has been the voice behind some of National Public Radio's biggest scoops over the years. And she recently wrote a memoir where she reminisced over one of her best friends, none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Nancy Cordes has that story.
She knew you weren't looking at her as a source. She knew you were looking at her as a friend.
If you have a Supreme Court justice friend, you don't ask about their work. Otherwise, they won't be your friend. Do you have any regrets?
I do think that I was born under a very bright star.
Nina interviewed RBG in public dozens of times. Their last private conversation was by phone, a few days before Ruth died.
There's more from Nina Totenberg on her friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg coming up a little later in the show.
She was more than a decade older than you. You were, very outgoing. She was a little more reserved. What do you think it was that connected the two of you in those early days?
I'm not sure, except that we were both on the outside looking in. And I think that made allies of women, and I'm sure you could say the same thing of minorities. There were so few of us then, but we were also very determined. And you really felt like you had your nose up against the window, saying to all the men inside, hey guys, we can do this too. Let us in. Let us in.
Then Serena Altschul met a so-called sound artist with a unique way of capturing the world around us.
Do people come up to you and just say, what are you doing?
I think people would be more likely if I didn't have my headset on, but sometimes somebody will wait. I can tell they really want to know, and I love sharing the work.
That work is multimedia sound art. Exploring a hidden universe most of us rarely experience or even think about, like under a stream or in the soil.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. She's spent nearly 5 decades as both National Public Radio's legal affairs correspondent and one of its most recognizable voices. Here's Nina Totenberg in conversation with our Nancy Cordes to talk about her front row seat to history behind the microphone.
When the lively hour of argument was over, all the justices except Clarence Thomas had asked many questions.
Nina Totenberg's lifelong search for facts began with fiction and her admiration for an intrepid teenage amateur detective.
I wanted to be like Nancy Drew, and that meant I wanted to be something of a sleuth.
Nina has been on the case ever since. First as a print reporter, and now for nearly 50 years as legal affairs correspondent for National Public Radio, where she's known for her scoops.
Publicly, some Republican senators are standing by the nominee.
It was her reporting that caused the 1987 Supreme Court nomination of Douglas Ginsburg to go up in smoke.
What I found was that he was a regular smoker of marijuana.
He was sunk.
He was sunk.
In her new memoir, published by Simon & Schuster, part of CBS parent company Paramount Global, Nina Totenberg writes that growing up in the 1950s, this kind of sleuthing was not necessarily in the cards.
I think my mother thought that I would be someone's administrative assistant like she had been, and that was the best I would be able to do.
Her father, the great concert violinist Roman Totenberg, thought differently.
Because he played with women musicians, he never suggested to me, oh, you can't do that because you're a woman.
She found she was the only woman in most newsrooms until she arrived at NPR in 1975.
Women were everywhere at NPR, doing all kinds of things, and even in administrative positions, because we paid so little, no man would take the job.
She became fast friends with All Things Considered co-host Susan Stamberg and reporters Linda Wertheimer and Cokie Roberts.
Today, they're known as NPR's founding mothers. But back then, their cluster of cubicles was dubbed the fallopian jungle.
I took it with a grain of salt at a kind of a compliment, because the jungle, you wouldn't dare go in there, right?
Right? I'd be afraid.
Yeah, so that's fine. Don't screw with me.
One of her biggest scoops came in 1991 when she uncovered something explosive during confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas.
I found out that there was a woman named Anita Hill who had accused then Judge Thomas of sexual harassment when she worked for him.
Anita Hill agreed to speak to her.
The relationship, she said, became even more strained when Thomas, in work situations, began to discuss sex.
So help you God.
I do.
And then Hill spoke to Congress.
He talked about pornographic material.
Republicans were furious and took aim at Totenberg.
You've been beating the drum on this one almost every day since it started.
I do not appreciate being blamed just because I do my job and report the news.
Listeners got to know her voice and her face, which ended up plastered all over the ultimate NPR status symbol.
Can we talk about the Nina Totenberg tote bag?
The Totenberg, I was initially very suspicious about it, but I love this. It makes me look great.
Nina also had a knack for befriending Supreme Court justices long before they were named to the court.
I first knew Scalia when he was in the Nixon administration, and the same was true for Chief Justice Rehnquist.
Her most famous friendship with the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg began 21 years before Ginsburg was nominated, when she was still a law professor at Rutgers University.
I was reading a brief of hers. There's a whole bunch in the brief that I didn't understand. Her telephone number was there, and I called her up, and I got an hour-long lecture.
That led to more calls and dinners where they talked about music and theater and fashion. They gossiped, and they leaned on each other as they both cared for dying husbands. Ruth was married to Marty Ginsburg for 56 years, Nina to Senator Floyd Haskell for 19 years.
She knew you weren't looking at her as a source. She knew you were looking at her as a friend.
If you have a Supreme Court justice friend, you don't ask about their work. Otherwise, they won't be your friend.
After Haskell's death, Nina met a widower, Dr. David Rines, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg married them in 2000.
I wasn't too worried about it, so we told my mother. And I said, not a rabbi, we got a judge. She said, a judge? I said, but she's Jewish. I don't care, it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't care, she's not a rabbi.
Rines could cook, which meant even more dinners with RBG, who always requested the bouillabaisse.
She would eat chicken, but her favorite was seafood. And in her last years of life, that last year, we cooked for her 23 consecutive Saturdays.
Nina's book is titled Dinners with Ruth. In it, she describes how Ruth and Dr. Rines would sneak away to discuss Ruth's medical challenges, including lung cancer, leaving Nina in the dark.
And I couldn't say anything. So for 6 weeks, I lied to her, basically.
Why did you feel like you had to lie?
A, it was a HIPAA violation, and B, I didn't want any leak.
Do you have any regrets?
I do think that I was born under a very bright star.
Nina interviewed RBG in public dozens of times. Their last private conversation was by phone, a few days before Ruth died.
I said to her, you are my darling friend, and it's been one of the great parts of my life that you've been my friend.
It turns out that the hard-hitting Nina Totenberg may not be as tough as she would have her sources believe.
I think I learned a lot from my friends to be a more generous person, how to be a better friend. I think they taught me to be a better person.
More exclusive excerpts from Nancy Cordes' chat with Nina Totenberg coming up a little later in the show. But up next, experience sounds of nature like you've never heard before. Babbling brooks and breezy beaches have a distinct sound. But what if we listened deeper? Serena Altschul found an artist who does just that.
Along the water's edge, Nikki Lindt patiently waits for her subject to sound. She's here in Long Island City, across the water from Manhattan, for the hum of the ferry and the wind blowing through the grass.
Do people come up to you and just say, what are you doing?
I think people would be more likely if I didn't have my headset on, but sometimes somebody will wait. I can tell they really want to know, and I love sharing the work.
That work is multimedia sound art, exploring a hidden universe most of us rarely experience or even think about, like under a stream or in the soil.
Underground, it's really resonant. It's almost, I would compare it in a way to a drum. It just carries sound in this really beautiful, deep, dramatic, mysterious way.
Here's what we might typically hear out walking in the woods. And here is what Lindt is able to capture with her subterranean microphones. A tree creaking. An acorn falling.
Just to spend time with a tree and learn this whole other thing about it that I didn't know before, what it sounds like inside. It creates a connection for me.
Come rain, sleet, or snow, Lindt records sounds all over the Northeast.
Do you still find surprises and things that are unexpected?
When I put my microphone under thawing icicles and they were hitting the ground, it really, really sounds like music. It's got that beat. I was mesmerized.
She started as a visual artist, but during a trip to Alaska 4 years ago to paint permafrost thawing, her ears perked up.
The sounds are almost meditative, but then at the same time relentless. And you realize what it is, so that's very, very scary.
A project starts with a few microphones and a deep-rooted curiosity.
I'm going to be putting a hydrophone in the water in different areas, and you'll hear the difference in the sounds in different parts of the stream.
Is this your happy place?
Oh, absolutely.
It just transports you. You're just not here. And immediately I have to smile.
Yeah. That's how I feel too. We're all interconnected as all kinds of species. And that becomes much more apparent when you slow down and become part of the surrounding around yourself. The excitement and opportunity to
A sentiment Nikki Lindt is hoping to share. Visitors to Brooklyn's Prospect Park can tune in to some of her underground recordings taken throughout the seasons here and in other areas of New York as part of a sound walk.
The walk is about a mile, and actually here's one of the signs.
Oh, nice. How many are there?
There are 8 stops along the route.
So next time you stop to smell the roses, remember to stop and listen too.
Are you always thinking about, wonder what it sounds like under this rock? I wonder what it sounds like inside that tree.
Absolutely. It's completely changed when I walk around and the wind blows and I see a bunch of grasses move in the wind. And it's just so magical. Like there's this whole frontier right under our feet.
Some of the best advice I got was from Ruth.
More from NPR's Nina Totenberg up next. Stay with us.
Just call me up and say, we have an extra ticket to this, or I have to go to a dinner. You want to come with us?
Welcome back. As promised, here's more from Nancy Cordes and Nina Totenberg.
You know, looking at it from the outside, you weren't necessarily natural candidates for such a close friendship to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was more than a decade older than you. You were, very outgoing. She was a little more reserved. What do you think it was that connected the two of you in those early days?
I'm not sure, except that we were both on the outside looking in. And I think that that made allies of women, and I'm sure you could say the same thing of minorities. There were so few of us then, but we were also very determined. And you really felt like you had your nose up against the window, saying to all the men inside, hey guys, we can do this too. Let us in. Let us in.
I was surprised how much time she gave you in those early days when you would call her and ask her about the law, and she'd spend an hour talking to you. She was a busy woman.
She was very busy, and she had young children and all of that, but she was very generous with her time.
What was your relationship like all those years when you did not live in the same city?
Well, I would call her periodically and say, I see you have a case, blah, 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 or this is happening, what do you think about that? And we would just talk on the phone. Usually it was about the law. And then I would see her at legal conferences, and then, of course, she moved to Washington, and that made a huge difference.
How did you feel when she came to Washington? How did that change your relationship?
Well, she became a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals, and that meant she lived in D.C. I would see her often. At cultural events, I would talk to her. I would, it was a very gradually, increasingly deep friendship. And I can't point to a particular moment, except that when she turned 50, her husband, Marty, put together a book of letters, and he asked her close friends to write letters to her on the occasion of her 50th birthday. And I thought, gee, I'm a close friend? That's so cool. And I wrote a letter. Amazingly, after her death, when I was writing this book, Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendships, I think it was probably a dreadful letter. I was so gawky, geeky, that I would not have written a good letter. And I called up her daughter Jane and I said, do you by any chance have the letter? Because they had all the papers at that point. And she said, yes, I do. I have that whole bunch of letters. And she emailed it to me. And it's pretty good. I actually talked about that first meeting in the cab. And I signed it Nina Totenberg, as if, who else is? I don't know.
It might be one of the other Ninas.
Yeah, one of the other Ninas. God knows what I was thinking. It was kind of funny and cute.
Do you think that your experience caring for your late husband for all of those years also taught you a lot about, first of all, your own inner strength and vulnerability, but also how much you needed to rely on other people?
Oh my God. I mean, Floyd fell and he had a major head injury, and he was in the hospital total for the better part of a year. And my friends and my sisters and my parents took such exquisite care of me and were always there. I don't know how I would have done it without them. And I learned that I could. I didn't think I could initially, but only because of other people and their help. And I learned that there is a really important and old-fashioned word, and that's duty. If you do your duty in the middle of a crisis, you will be a better person for it, for want of a better expression, a better person. You learn that about yourself. And I put that into my commencement speeches.
And caring for Floyd was your duty.
It was my duty. Absolutely. My duty was to take care of him, and he needed a lot of care. And I had a lot of help doing that from my friends.
How did you work during that time? Because I'm sure your listeners could not tell what you were going through.
Some of the best advice I got was from Ruth. She would typically just call me up and say, we have an extra ticket to this, or I have to go to a dinner. You want to come with us? And she said to me, you know, Nina, you're not doing him any good there. You have to go. You have to make sure that he's being properly cared for. But you need to go back to work. It may not be the best work you ever do, but it'll be good enough. And then you will not lose yourself, and you will be there for him when he comes home. Wow. And it was just fabulous advice. And she knew this from her own experience because Marty had testicular cancer when they were in law school. And so she knew this from her own experience, although she did everything. You know, she took care of a toddler. She typed up his papers. Her night owlishness started, I think, then when she would finish all of everything at midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning and turn to her own law school work. And she was on the law review, and Marty wasn't.
But he knew she would be. He was her biggest booster.
He was her biggest booster, and he always said, in law school, he said, my wife's going to be on the law review. And of course she was.
And later he said, my wife's going to be a Supreme Court justice.
Well, he didn't say it out loud. He helped make it happen. As much, you know, he again went into this mode of collecting letters from people to sort of bring her to the attention of President Clinton, because she wasn't on anybody's Clinton list of potential Supreme Court nominees. You know, Ruth was very quiet, but she was a great performer. And once he met her, every person I knew in the White House said he fell for her hook, line, and sinker, and that was it.
I'm Tracy Smith. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you here next time on Here Comes the Sun.